Hello and welcome to Monday in Parliament, our look at the day at Westminster. The headlines: angry scenes in the House of Commons as the Home Secretary announces there will not be an inquiry into the 1984 Battle of Orgreave, one of the most violent events of the miners' strike.
Aren't we right in concluding that the establishment stitch-up that she has just announced today is nothing more than a nakedly political act?
Amber Rudd insists she's weighed the decision carefully. The Health Secretary clashes with the Conservative chair of the Health Select Committee on England's NHS funding.
I stick by those facts.
I don't agree with the letter she wrote today, and I'm afraid I do think her calculations are wrong.
And the government says it won't be releasing the details of its agreement with the Nissan car plant in Sunderland. But first, there will be no public inquiry into the events of the Orgreave coking works in South Yorkshire during the 1984 miners' strike, the Home Secretary has announced. The police reaction to a picket, with charges by mounted police and allegations police statements were pre-prepared by other officers, has led to a long-running campaign for an inquiry. In angry exchanges in the House of Commons, the Home Secretary defended her decision, saying the so-called Battle of Orgreave did not compare to the Hillsborough disaster because there have been no deaths or miscarriages of justice.
I have concluded that there is no case for either a statutory inquiry or an independent review.
Christian Matheson.
This is an astonishing and frankly shameful decision by the government. The government have led those families up the garden path for the last 2 years. Does she not understand that the disinfecting light of a justice inquiry, of a truthful inquiry, is the only thing that will give those communities and those families the confidence that they need back in the South Yorkshire Police Force?
Once again, the name South Yorkshire Police does besmirch the brave officers on the front line. And I have raised in this House on several occasions, and I raise it again today. Would my right honourable friend, along with my honourable friend the Policing Minister, meet with me to have a serious discussion about whether South Yorkshire Police and West Yorkshire Police can be merged to become Yorkshire Police, so that the name South Yorkshire Police does not do an injustice to the officers who are bravely putting their lives on the line every day?
Why is it that the government, and it appears to be the government, have now taken a decision which is contrary to the one that the previous Home Secretary, now the Prime Minister, gave in answer to my right honourable friend several months ago?
Well, I can tell the honourable gentleman that I have taken this very seriously. I have spoken to the former Home Secretary about the decision, and I have ensured that all the matters and the papers were carefully considered. We have taken our time to arrive at this decision. There was no commitment made before, only a willingness to look at all the evidence.
Whilst public inquiries can, in some instances, be successful, too often they cost huge amounts of money, they take many years, and they don't even answer the question they're asked.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for that point. And in a way, the easier political decision would have been for the government to agree to an inquiry. But I cannot see that it is in the public interest, given the substantial changes to policing that has taken place since 1984.
Andy Burnham.
Given that the IPCC found evidence of perjury and perversion of the course of justice, and given that in the last month new evidence has emerged from former police officers who were at Orgreave of orchestrated violence and the mass manufacture of police statements, aren't we right in concluding that the establishment stitch-up that she has just announced today is nothing more than a nakedly political act?
No, the right honourable gentleman is entirely wrong. He chooses to politicise it where there is none here. I had a meeting, as he knows, with the campaign group. We had a frank exchange of information about it. But the fact is, just because he disagrees with the decision I have made does not mean that it is the wrong decision at all. I have made it honestly based on the evidence.
I wonder whether we could not consider the House actually having the courage to have a select committee inquiry. I say this because I can understand the government is dubious about another public inquiry with wall-to-wall lawyers costing tens of millions of pounds and taking years. But if the government could free an ad hoc select committee where there's a head of steam behind an issue from the Osmotherley rules, and we could have a proper select committee under a senior member of the House and be able to interview all witnesses, including advice to ministers, we could actually deal with this sort of issue much more cheaply than a public inquiry.
Well, it's a very interesting suggestion from my right honourable friend. I believe that sort of set-up would be a matter for the House.
We know the South Yorkshire Police lied about what happened at Hillsborough, yet only 5 years earlier, the same South Yorkshire Police, many of the same commanders, behaved in a very similar way at Orgreave. The Orgreave families and campaigners need the same justice as Hillsborough had. They need the same type of independent inquiry to establish the truth.
I would respectfully say to the right honourable lady that the Hillsborough situation was quite different to Orgreave. 96 people died. It was right that we had an inquiry that analysed exactly what happened on the day. In this situation, in Orgreave, there were no miscarriages of justice. There were no deaths. There were no convictions. The right honourable lady should be aware. Therefore, it doesn't merit the same level of status as a public inquiry as was required for Hillsborough.
The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. Now, the Health Secretary has defended his claim that £10 billion has been made available to NHS frontline services in England. But a shadow health minister, whose urgent question on the issue summoned Jeremy Hunt to the Commons, said the only way it could be more discredited is if it were on the side of a bus driven by the Foreign Secretary.
Following last year's spending review, I can confirm to the House the NHS will in fact receive an increase of £10 billion in real terms over the 6 years since the 5-year forward view was published. In cash terms, that will see the NHS budget increase from £98.1 billion in 2014-15 to £119.9 billion in 2020-2021, a highly significant rise at a time when public finances are severely constrained by the deficit this government regrettably inherited.
Isn't it the reality, Mr. Speaker, that this government has cut adult social care, they have cut the public health budget, has cut the NHS capital budget, and now we learn that the average amount we spend on healthcare for each person in this country will actually fall in 2018-19. Doesn't this raise serious questions, Mr. Speaker, about the claims ministers and indeed Prime Ministers have been making from that dispatch box? In fact, the only way that the government's figures could be further discredited, Mr. Speaker, is if the Secretary of State slapped them on the side of a bus and got the Foreign Secretary to drive it.
The NHS wanted £8 billion. Labour's promise of additional funding was £2.5 billion. That is not £6 billion, not £4 billion, but £2.5 billion more, less than a third of what the NHS said they needed. And even if you accept the chair of the Select Committee's numbers, which I will go on to explain to the House I do not, Labour were pledging over the course of the Parliament only around half what this government has actually delivered in the first year of the spending review.
Whilst I accept that he doesn't agree with the Health Committee's appraisal of the £10 billion figure, I'm afraid that I stick by those figures.
Well, let me start by saying that I have enormous respect for my honourable friend. I respect her passion for the NHS, her knowledge about it and her background in it. So I would always listen very carefully to anything that she says. I hope she will also understand that just as she speaks plainly today, I need to speak plainly back and say that I don't agree with the letter she wrote today, and I'm afraid I do think her calculations are wrong.
Isn't there an urgent need to be absolutely straight with the British public about the resources we will need to maintain both the NHS and the care system, and to confront the fact that we will all actually have to pay a bit more to ensure that our loved ones get care when they need it?
Well, when he and I worked in government, we both campaigned hard on many occasions for more funding for the NHS, including mental health, which is a particular priority of both of ours. And I think the answer to his question is yes.
The Secretary of State will know I wrote to him over summer because at Royal Stoke we had trolleys bumper to bumper in hospital corridors, not in midwinter but in high summer. Since then we've had more hospital bed closures in cottage hospitals. So can I repeat the invitation and ask the Secretary of State to come to Stoke-on-Trent, see if for himself the crisis in the funding settlement, hitting some of those with the most chronic health conditions.
I'm very happy to visit his hospital. It's been a hospital I've been concerned about for some time. I know that it's been particularly challenging in the wake of what happened in neighbouring Mid-Staffs.
If the government had stood by their word and invested the promised £10 billion in the NHS, does the Secretary of State agree that the downgrade of Dewsbury A&E might not have been necessary?
Well, first of all, can I welcome her to her place in this House. I'm sure she will make an extremely important contribution, and yes, she is filling very big boots, but I think she's made a very good start, if I may say. In terms of what happens with A&E departments, the changes in the pattern of services we provide is something that's been a feature of both when her party's been in power and when my own party's been in power, because the needs of the people who use the NHS also changes.
Jeremy Hunt replying to Labour's Tracy Brabin, who replaced her friend Jo Cox as MP for Batley and Spen. Now, the Business Secretary has indicated he won't release his letter to Nissan, which led to the car maker's decision on new investment at its Sunderland plant, securing the future of 7,000 jobs. Appearing in the Commons, Greg Clark was pressed to provide more details of his dealings with Nissan, and Labour called for his letter to the firm to be published.
It is a stunning tribute to the local workforce, which has made the Sunderland plant, in the words of the Chief Executive of Nissan, a globally competitive powerhouse. We are immensely proud of it and proud of them. And of course, the decision is great news for the people of the North East more widely, for our world-class automotive sector, and for the whole of the British economy.
Mr Clark said he had given assurances to Nissan on competitiveness, training and innovation.
In our negotiations to leave the EU, we will emphasise the very strong common ground that there is, especially in the automotive sector, between ourselves and other EU member states, in ensuring that trade between us can be free and unencumbered by impediments. A good deal for the UK can also be a good deal for other member states, and that is how we will approach the negotiations.
Mr Speaker, can I join the Secretary of State in warmly welcoming Nissan's decision to keep production in the UK. It's fantastic news for Nissan's 7,000 employees and the 38,000 plus employees who rely on its supply chain. It's fantastic news for Sunderland, and it's fantastic news for the country as a whole. It's also testament to the skill, productivity and ability of the workforce and management that Nissan has such confidence in its Sunderland operation.
But he said Mr Clark had refused to be transparent about what had been offered.
We on these benches want the economy firing on all cylinders, not spluttering along on one or two. As we embark on Brexit, Britain needs a government that is visionary, not reactive, that is strategic, not shambolic. As a start, Mr Speaker, we need a government that is transparent and accountable instead of secretive. Why not start now? I say to the right honourable gentleman, if you didn't offer Nissan a sweetener, then what have you got to hide? Show us the letter.
My responsibility on behalf of the government is to encourage and to attract investment in this country. And it's important that when companies of all types and in all sectors share with me their investment plans and that are of information to their prospective competitors, that they can be assured that they are not going to be disclosed to their competitors to their disadvantage.
He said to the BBC yesterday that our objective would be to have continued access without tariff or bureaucratic impediments. Now, that's not been said today, but I think that's correct. But if that objective is not realised, what will the cost be to the taxpayer in terms of a deal with Nissan? How much will it cost to make good those tariffs should they be imposed? That is the key question in terms of this.
If you just come clean on one other issue he left off his list of things, which I'm sure he did say to them when he spoke to them, which was he reminded them that the UK outside the European Union will be able to set its own new trade deals, and just guess which car manufacturers will benefit from free trade deals with the rest of the world.
It's a welcome example of targeted government commitment to a successful company in a strategically vital sector in the most important region on earth. However, will the same sort of targeted investment be available to other firms and sectors? If so, how will these be selected in the context of a proper industrial strategy?
Special deals for the car industry, for the financial services sector, actually offer very little comfort to the literally thousands of small businesses, the length and breadth of this country, which incidentally does go north of Newcastle as well.
Isn't this deal a signal to those Remainers who have become Remoaners that they should recalibrate their doom and gloom and become far more optimistic about the future of this country outside the European Union?
Can he tell the House whether his offer of tariff-free access to the European market will be available to all other parts of our manufacturing sector, given what he said a moment ago, when, if I heard him right, he indicated that the government might take a different approach to different sectors. And if that means that some of them might not benefit from tariff-free access, they'd like to know pretty quickly.
It's not in my gift to offer tariff-free access to the single market. What I was describing was what would be a positive outcome from the negotiations, and therefore what's the demeanour that we should take in those negotiations. As I meet, as my colleagues meet, my right honourable friend paid me a personal compliment, but my team share my vigour in talking to companies up and down the land to make sure that we understand what is important to them to inform our negotiation. That seems to be an eminently sensible thing to do.
You're watching Monday in Parliament. Still to come, the House of Lords takes a look at children's teeth and doesn't like what it sees.
There's an epidemic of child tooth decay and hospital admissions for extractions. My Lords, the state of the nation's children's teeth is shocking.
But first, the scheme that assesses claimants of disability benefits is to be overhauled, with ministers promising to extend a revolution of getting more people into work. The Work and Pensions Secretary, Damien Green, told the Commons he wanted a personalised way to help more disabled people find jobs. But the opposition have accused the government of talk rather than action.
It's clear that for many disabled people, the barriers to entering work are still too high. That for people in work who get ill, too often fall out of work, lose contact, lose confidence and don't return to work. The impact extends far beyond the individual. Families suffer, the health service faces extra strain, and employers lose valuable skills. But most of all, it's a human tragedy. Potential is left unfulfilled. Lives are lessened. Of course, the health and welfare systems must support those that will never be able to work. It should offer the opportunity of work for all those who can, provide help for those who could, and care for those who can't. It is the help for those who could that through this Green Paper we will transform.
This is the third Secretary of State who has promised a plan, and yet we have just talk, no action. During his announcement today, the Secretary of State claimed that he was confronting negative attitudes, prejudices and misunderstandings. The audacity of the statement is offensive. The government has been responsible for more than anything of the negative attitude towards disabled people with their shirkus grandeur narrative. Only this morning he himself described disabled people as sitting at home living on benefits.
One of the keys to success in ending the enormous waste of human potential is, for the very first time, to get health services and his department working together far more effectively at a community level to ensure that people on long-term sickness benefits get meaningful employment support and effective health intervention, because at the moment the current system too often provides neither.
At my surgery on Saturday, I saw a man who will be 59 in 2 weeks' time, walking with tremendous difficulties on 2 crutches, who has had his employment and support allowance removed. During the time I was speaking to him, he broke down in such distress. What sort of position are we in that a law-abiding person of his age, suffering from disablement, is in a position where he goes to his Member of Parliament and is in such a state of distress that he starts crying?
I welcome the Green Paper in its broadest sense, so we can have a dialogue about how we can improve the life of disabled people. But as the point has just been made, you need to make sure that the funding is there on the table in order to protect people back into work and those that need support. Perhaps there are two words which are missing from the document today, from the Minister's statement, and that is compassion and dignity. Let's hope that we get that in the response from the Government.
Yeah. Can I suggest to the Minister there are two things he could do for people with mental health conditions now. One is to ensure that those assessors undertaking work capability tests are properly qualified. Yes. And secondly, could we take out the small number of people with long-term enduring mental health conditions who are never going to work and stop them going around this merry-go-round, which is neither good for them or the taxpayer?
Well, I'm grateful for the expertise that the honourable gentleman brings to this. And I will take both his points on board. In fact, his second point, he may have seen, I've already announced that for those who have got a condition which already means that they can't work and which will only stay the same or get worse, we are going to stop retesting them, because that seems to me a piece of pointless and some fundamentally heartless bureaucracy that we can happily get rid of.
Damien Green. Now, a UN convention from 1954 seeking to protect the cultural property of different countries is finally making its way into UK law. The measure has support from Labour and the SNP, but it was suggested that some of the most recent destruction of cultural heritage by so-called Islamic State or Daesh would not be fully covered.
In recent months, we have seen the wanton destruction of cultural heritage in the Middle East and North Africa. These tragic events are a reminder of how vital it is that the UK ratifies this convention and makes a strong statement about the importance we place on protecting cultural heritage.
Honourable members will remember that it was in 1700 BC that the Assyrians invaded Mesopotamia, now called Ramadi and Fallujah in Iraq, and stole the stone gods of the Arab tribes and took them back to Nineveh to force the Arabs to negotiate to get their gods back. And it's a sad fact, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that the current treatment of cultural artefacts in the exact same locations has progressed so little over the intervening 3,500 years.
A people's cultural heritage is a crucial part of who they are and what they were in the past. For almost all communities anywhere in the world, it is a symbol whose importance cannot be overstated. What also cannot be overstated is the social and economic importance that cultural heritage will be in helping Syria, Iraq and Libya and others, once Daesh is defeated, to begin to recover.
Isn't the irony that part of the topicality of this bill and enthusiasm for it has come from seeing the horrors of Daesh in Syria and elsewhere, but also the fact that this bill doesn't actually fully cover the activities of Daesh, because, as I understand, it doesn't apply to Syria because it only covers unlawfully exported cultural property from occupied territories, of which Daesh is not covered by that.
David Burrows there, the Secretary of State, said she'd write to him further on that point. Now, the state of children's teeth was under discussion in the House of Lords, with the Liberal Democrat peer Lady Benjamin, a children's broadcaster, telling peers action was needed as a matter of urgency.
In the government's childhood obesity plan, oral health was not mentioned, even though there's an epidemic of child tooth decay and hospital admissions for extractions. My Lords, the state of the nation's children's teeth is shocking and huge cost to the NHS. Common sense says we need targeted action now.
The Noble Lady is right that childhood oral health is very poor, but it is getting better. 75% of children no longer have tooth decay, compared to 69% only in 2008. But it is still not good enough. And the government's policy is very much around prevention rather than treatment. There's a new contract being discussed with the dentist now, which will put it more onto a capitated basis rather than an activity basis.
A Labour peer said the answer
is to introduce fluoride into the water
and ignore those people who think it's a bad thing, when all the evidence seems to suggest that it would be a very good thing, especially for deprived communities.
Lord, I think the evidence for fluoride is incontrovertible, that it is good for teeth. Now, there may be other issues attached to fluoride, but in terms of teeth, it is unquestionably a good thing. Interestingly, in Birmingham, where they've had fluoride in the water for many years, the incidence of child tooth decay is 29%, whereas in Blackburn it's 57%. In Hull, where they are considering fluoridisation, is 28%. So I think the evidence is very strong.
Given the harm caused by high levels of sugar added to some processed foods, would the Minister agree with me that the present restraints on the food industry are woefully inadequate? And would he further agree that much tougher measures need to be taken if the government is to meet its own objectives in public health on oral health, diabetes and obesity?
Well, I think the introduction of the sugar levy is evidence that the government is taking this extremely seriously and believe that it can't just be left solely to industry to reduce sugar levels.
The House of Lords on an evening when children were roaming the streets for sweets on the importance of cleaning our teeth afterwards. And that's all from me for now. Keith McDougall's here for the rest of the week, but from me, Joanna Shin, goodbye.